My father won the lottery and kicked me out. Then I proved the ticket was fake and left him broke. I don't need your filthy money anymore. Get out. But when I saw the lottery ticket, I burst out laughing because the ticket was... My name is Marcelo. I'm 28 years old, and until recently, I lived with my parents, Louise and Claudia, in a modest house in a quiet city neighborhood. It wasn't always like this. Of course, there was a time when we were a close-knit family, the kind that sits down to eat together and laughs at the silliest things. But life takes unexpected turns, and what started as a gesture of love and responsibility on my part ended up turning into a nightmare I never saw coming. It all began when my parents lost their jobs. My dad, Louise, worked as a mechanic in a workshop that closed down due to the economic crisis. My mom, Claudia, was a receptionist at a small company that also went bankrupt. From one day to the next, they were left without an income, without savings, and worst of all, without a pension to support them. I, who at that time had a stable job as an accounting assistant at a medium-sized company, became the sole breadwinner of the house. I didn't complain. They were my family, and I felt it was my duty to help them. Besides, at first, everything seemed to be going well. I paid the rent, the bills for electricity, water, internet, food, everything. I even made sure they didn't lack for anything, from the coffee my mom loved so much to my dad's blood pressure pills. They were grateful, of course. My mom would hug me and tell me I was an angel sent from heaven. My dad, more reserved, would pat me on the back and murmur, "Thanks, son." I felt I was doing the right thing, what any son would do for his parents. But things began to change slowly, almost without me noticing. It all started when I got a promotion at work. I was given the position of accounting analyst with a salary increase that, while not a fortune, allowed me to live a little more comfortably. One night during dinner, I excitedly told my parents about it. I thought they would be happy for me, that we would celebrate this small achievement together, but that's not what happened. My mom smiled, but it was a forced smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. My dad, for his part, barely looked up from his plate and said something like, "That's great, Marcelo, let's see how long it lasts." It was a strange comment, but I didn't pay it any mind. I thought he was just tired or in a bad mood. Over time, these attitudes became more frequent. Every time I mentioned something positive about my job, a bonus, a new project, a compliment from my boss, I felt the atmosphere in the house grow heavier. My dad started making sarcastic comments like, "Look at Mr. Important, now he's really going to look down on us." My mom, though she didn't say much, would nod or stay silent as if she agreed. I didn't understand what was happening. Weren't they supposed to be happy for me? I wasn't bragging. I was just sharing my life with them as I had always done. The relationship grew cold. There were no more long chats in the living room or shared laughter. When I came home from work, I'd find them watching television in silence or shut away in their room. If I tried to talk to them, they would answer me in monosyllables or with curt phrases. "I'm tired, Marcelo. Leave me alone," my dad would say. My mom, on the other hand, always had an excuse. "Not now, I'm busy." But busy with what? They didn't work. They didn't leave the house. They had no responsibilities beyond basic household chores, which, by the way, I also helped with when I came home exhausted from work. What hurt the most was feeling like they treated me as a stranger, as if my presence in the house was a nuisance. I tried talking to them a couple of times, asking if something was wrong, if I had done something to upset them, but they always told me the same thing. "Nothing's wrong, Marcelo, you're exaggerating." And like a fool, I believed them. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that it was just a phase, that we would soon go back to being the family we used to be. But then the money issues started. I have always been organized with my finances. I'm not one to spend without control, and although my salary wasn't a fortune, it was enough to cover the household bills and save a little. I kept some cash in a small box on my nightstand. Not much, just a few loose bills and coins for small expenses like transportation or an occasional outing with friends. One day, I noticed a couple of 20 peso bills were missing. I didn't think much of it. I thought maybe I had spent them and forgotten, but then it happened again. A week later, 50 pesos were missing, and then 100. I started to worry. At first, I didn't want to suspect my parents. I felt guilty just thinking about it. They were my parents. How could I imagine they were stealing from me? But the amounts kept increasing, and it didn't make sense. No one else entered my room, and I always closed the door when I left for work. I decided to run a test. I counted exactly how much money was in the box before I left for work and checked it when I got back. That day, 200 pesos were missing. My heart sank. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night after dinner, I gathered the courage to ask them. I didn't want to sound accusatory, so I tried to be as careful as possible. "Hey, have either of you taken any money from my little box? I'm not saying you did it on purpose, but I've noticed I'm missing some cash." The silence that followed was so heavy I felt the air grow thick. My dad looked at me with narrowed eyes as if I had just slapped him. "What are you implying, Marcelo, that we're thieves?" My mom stood up dramatically, placing a hand on her chest. "How dare you say such a thing after all we've given you?" I was stunned. I tried to explain that I wasn't accusing them, that I just wanted to understand what was happening, but they wouldn't let me speak. My dad raised his voice. "You're ungrateful. You live in our house, eat our food, and now you call us thieves?" My mom started to cry, saying she couldn't believe her own son thought so poorly of them. It was as if they had rehearsed the scene. I felt so bad that I ended up apologizing, even though deep down I knew something wasn't right. After that, I decided not to keep money in the box anymore. I started carrying the cash with me, or depositing it in a bank account. I didn't want any more conflict, but the mistrust had already settled in. And although I wouldn't admit it out loud, I was beginning to realize that my parents were not the people I thought they were. A few months later, I saw something that gave me a clue as to what was happening. One afternoon, coming home from work, I stopped by the corner store to buy something to eat. There was my dad at the counter buying lottery tickets. Not one or two, but a handful. He held them in his hand, looking them over with a smile I hadn't seen on his face in months. I stood in the doorway, watching him. Where had he gotten the money to buy so many tickets? In that moment, everything clicked into place. The money that went missing, the strange attitudes, the sarcastic comments. My dad had become addicted to gambling. I didn't say anything. I didn't want another confrontation, but in my head, it all made sense. He was using my money to feed his lottery obsession. I felt betrayed, but also helpless. What could I do? Kick them out of the house that I myself was paying for? Stop helping them and watch them fall into misery? Despite everything, they were still my parents. I still loved them, or at least I wanted to cling to the idea that we could be a family again. The weeks passed and the situation at home didn't improve. My dad continued with his cold and distant attitude. My mom barely spoke to me, and I felt more and more like an intruder in my own home. I worked all day, paid all the bills, and still felt like it wasn't enough for them, that it would never be, until the day that changed everything. It was a Friday night. I had had an exhausting day at the office, and all I wanted was to get home, eat something, and rest. But when I opened the door, I heard a shout that made me stop in my tracks. It was my dad, Luis, yelling with joy as if he had won a world championship. I ran into the living room and saw him hugging my mom, both of them laughing and jumping like children. "I did it, Claudia, I did it," he shouted. My mom hugged him with tears in her eyes, saying, "We're not going to be dependent anymore. It's over." I stood in the doorway completely confused. "What's going on?" I asked. My dad turned to me, and for the first time in months, he looked me directly in the eyes. But there was no warmth in his gaze, only a mix of triumph and contempt. "I won the lottery, Marcelo," he said, holding up a ticket. "I won the lottery. We don't need you to support us anymore, to humiliate us with your money." I was shocked not by the lottery win, but by his words, "humiliate them." That's what they thought of me. I tried to respond, to explain that it had never been my intention to make them feel that way, that everything I did was to help them, but he wouldn't let me speak. "I don't need your filthy money anymore. Get out of my house," he shouted, pointing to the door. My mom, instead of defending me, nodded and took his side. "It's for the best, Marcelo. We don't need you anymore." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Everything I had done for them, all the effort, the sacrifices, and this was what I received in return. My dad didn't wait for my response. He stormed up the stairs like a whirlwind, went into my room and started pulling out my clothes, my belongings, everything. He threw it all into the hallway, shouting, "Get out! We don't want anything of yours here." I stood paralyzed in the living room as my mom looked at me with a mixture of guilt and determination. I didn't know what to do. I felt betrayed, humiliated, but also furious. It was then that my eyes fell on the lottery ticket my dad had left on the table. I picked it up, more out of curiosity than anything else, and then I saw it. I couldn't help it. I started to laugh. At first it was a low chuckle, but it soon turned into a full-blown laugh that I couldn't control. My mom looked at me confused. "What's wrong with you, Marcelo? Why are you laughing?" My dad came down the stairs, still holding one of my shirts, and looked at me as if I were crazy. "What's so funny?" he growled. I kept laughing, holding the ticket in my hand. "Dad, this ticket is expired," I said between laughs. "You didn't even check the date. It's from last year, but the last number has been altered to make it look real." My dad's face went pale. He snatched the ticket from my hand, examining it over and over as if he could change reality just by looking at it. My mom came closer, worried, and when she saw the date, she covered her mouth and started to cry. "It can't be," she mumbled. My dad, for his part, staggered and had to sit down. He looked like he was going to faint. I couldn't stop laughing. It wasn't just about the ticket, but about the absurdity of it all, the irony. They had kicked me out of the house, treated me like dirt, all because they thought they were rich. And now here they were facing the truth. They had nothing. Absolutely nothing. "Well," I said, still laughing, "since you don't want me here anymore, I'm leaving. From now on, you pay your own bills." I turned around and started to pick up my things that my dad had thrown into the hallway. Suddenly, their attitude changed completely. My mom approached me, pleading, "No, Marcelo, don't go, please. We made a mistake." My dad, his voice trembling, added, "Son, stay. We don't know what to do without you." But I wasn't listening anymore. I was fed up with their envy, their lies, their theft. "You humiliated me," I told them, looking them straight in the eyes. "You threw me out like a dog. You threw my things into the street. Now you can fend for yourselves." I grabbed my bags, walked out of the house, and didn't look back, even though their pleas echoed in my ears. That night, I stayed at a friend's house, Javier, who took me in without asking any questions. The next day, I found a small apartment just for me. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I started saving money, focusing on my work, on my life, and although I wouldn't admit it out loud, I felt a kind of justice. My parents had reaped what they sowed. The first few days were strange. I was used to the sound of my parents' television, to their voices arguing over silly things, to the smell of my mom's coffee in the morning. In my new apartment, everything was silent. At first, I had trouble sleeping. I would lie there staring at the ceiling, thinking about them. Were they okay? Had they realized what they had lost? But every time those thoughts came, I reminded myself of what they had done. They had treated me like a stranger. They had stolen from me. They had kicked me out. They didn't deserve my concern. At work, things were going well. My boss, Mr. Ramirez, had taken a liking to me because I always arrived early and finished my reports ahead of schedule. One day, he called me into his office and told me they were considering promoting me again, this time to coordinator of the accounting team. "Marcelo, you have what it takes to be a leader," he said with a smile. "Keep it up, and in a couple of years you could be managing your own department." I didn't know what to say. I just smiled and thanked him, but inside I was screaming with excitement. For the first time I felt that my effort was worthwhile, that someone recognized it. Meanwhile, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. It was my parents. At first I ignored them. I didn't want to hear their excuses or their pleas, but the calls were constant, day and night. They left voicemails that I initially didn't listen to. But one day, out of curiosity, I opened one. It was my mom, her voice trembling. "Marcelo, son, please answer me. We were wrong. We know. We can't handle the bills. We have no one else. Please come back." Then another message, this time from my dad. "Son, I know I failed you, but we are your family. Don't leave us like this." Hearing them stirred something inside me. I won't deny it. Despite everything, they were still my parents. But every time I felt that pang of guilt, I remembered their faces when they threw me out, the way my dad threw my clothes into the street, how my mom said nothing to defend me. No, I wasn't going to give in. Not this time. 1 week after moving out, I decided to answer them, but not to reconcile. I wanted to close that chapter once and for all. I called them and put the phone on speaker while I organized my apartment. "Marcelo, son, thank God you answered," my mom said, almost crying. "We need to talk to you." "There's nothing to talk about," I said curtly. "You kicked me out. You treated me like dirt even though I paid for everything, and now you want me to come back as if nothing happened." "Marcelo, please understand us," my dad said in a tone that tried to be conciliatory but sounded fake to me. "We were excited about the ticket. We made a mistake, but you're our son. We can't live without you." "Without me or without my money?" I asked. Silence on the other end of the line. I knew I had hit the nail on the head. "You were always jealous of me, weren't you? Because I had a job, because I had a salary, because I wasn't in misery like you, and on top of that, you stole from me. Do you think I didn't notice the money disappearing from my box?" "That's not true," my mom shouted, but her voice trembled. My dad said nothing, which to me was a confession. "Marcelo, we love you. Don't believe those things." "You don't love me," I said, feeling a strange calm as I spoke. "You never did. You loved what I could give you, but that's over. Pay your own bills, find jobs, do whatever you have to do. I am not your bank anymore." I hung up before they could respond. I turned off my phone and sat on the sofa, looking at the empty walls of my apartment. I felt no guilt, no sadness. I felt relief. For the first time, I was putting myself first. 1 month later, I found out what happened to my parents. They had to leave the house. They couldn't pay the rent, or the electricity, or anything. Now they're living in a rented room in a shared house, the kind where several families live. Louise is working as a helper at a market, carrying boxes, but it's not enough. And Claudia is cleaning houses. I felt a pang in my chest, but it wasn't sadness. It was a mix of anger and something I couldn't quite name. Satisfaction, perhaps. Not because I wanted to see them suffer, but because I felt that life was giving them what they deserved. One afternoon, I decided to drive through the old neighborhood. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to close that chapter for good. The house where I lived with my parents had new tenants, a family with children playing in the front yard. I just watched from the street, remembering the days when everything seemed normal. Now as I write this, I am sitting in my apartment with a pet sleeping by my side and a cup of coffee in my hand. My life isn't perfect, but it's mine. And that's more than my parents ever gave me. Life served justice, and I am finally free. I often think back to that exact moment, the sound of my own laughter echoing off the living room walls. People usually associate laughter with joy, but what tore out of my throat that night was born of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. It was the sound of a 28-year-old man realizing that the foundation of his entire existence was built on sand. For years, I had carried the weight of the world on my shoulders, convincing myself that the exhaustion burning in my muscles and the constant anxiety humming in my chest were simply the price of love. I had convinced myself that a good son doesn't complain, doesn't question, and certainly doesn't keep score. But as I stared at that altered, expired lottery ticket, the dam finally broke. The absurdity of it all shattered the illusion I had fought so desperately to maintain.
My parents didn't love me. They loved the utility I provided.
The moment they thought they had a better offer, they discarded me like a broken appliance. The hardest part of the last few months hasn't been the financial adjustment or the logistics of living alone. The hardest part has been mourning people who are still alive. When someone dies, there is a funeral. There are rituals, condolences, and a clear, universally understood reason for your grief. But how do you explain to people that you are grieving the parents who live just a few miles away? I mourn the mother who used to bake cookies on rainy Sundays, and the father who taught me how to ride a bike. I mourn the family we were before the money ran out, and desperation poisoned our home. Sometimes the grief hits me in the quiet moments. I'll be in the supermarket, walking past the aisle with my dad's favorite brand of coffee, or I'll see an older couple walking hand in hand in the park, and a heavy lump will form in my throat. I have to remind myself, sometimes speaking out loud to the empty aisles, that the parents I am crying for no longer exist. They were replaced by strangers consumed by bitterness, envy, and greed. Society conditions us to believe that family is absolute. Blood is thicker than water, they say. You only get one mother and father. For a long time, those platitudes were the chains that kept me bound to my childhood home. Even after moving into my own apartment, the guilt was a physical presence, sitting heavy on my chest every time I tried to sleep. Was I a monster for letting them struggle? Was I violating some sacred natural law by not answering their phone calls? It took countless sleepless nights to dismantle that conditioning. I had to painfully deconstruct every interaction we had over the last few years. I had to force myself to remember the missing cash from my nightstand, the snide remarks about my promotions, the coldness in my father's eyes when he yelled at me to get out of his house. I had to realize that I didn't abandon them. They evicted me. They severed the bond the second they decided my presence was a humiliation to their imaginary wealth. I am not punishing them by staying away. I am simply protecting myself from further emotional abuse. Healing has been a strange, non-linear process. At first, I didn't know how to exist without the constant pressure of providing for them. I would get my paycheck and immediately feel a surge of panic, my brain instinctively calculating how much I needed to set aside for my father's pills or my mother's groceries. Learning to spend my own money on myself felt like a crime. The first time I bought a new jacket, something I genuinely wanted, not something I desperately needed, I felt so nauseous I almost returned it. But slowly the panic began to subside. I started to rediscover who Marcelo was outside of being a financial crutch. I found that I like quiet mornings. I like drinking my coffee while looking out the window, without the soundtrack of televised complaints or passive-aggressive sighs. I like the absolute sovereignty I have over my own space. If I want to leave a book on the table, it stays there. If I want to invite a friend over, I don't have to navigate a minefield of dark moods. The peace I have found in this small apartment is worth more than any lottery jackpot. Hearing about their current situation, living in a cramped rented room, my father doing manual labor at his age, my mother cleaning up after strangers, brings a complex storm of emotions. Part of me, the wounded child who is thrown out onto the street, feels a dark, vindictive satisfaction. It is the raw, undeniable thrill of cosmic justice. They gambled their reality for a delusion, and the house always wins. But there is another part of me, the part that is trying to heal, that just feels a profound, exhausting sadness for the utter waste of it all. It didn't have to be this way. We could have survived the hardship together. If they had only offered me a fraction of the grace and gratitude I poured into them, we would still be a close-knit family. But they chose their pride over their son. They chose the fantasy of wealth over the reality of my sacrifice. Now, as I sit on my sofa with my dog resting his chin on my knee, I finally understand what family truly means. It isn't just about shared DNA or a shared history. True family is about mutual respect, safety, and unconditional support. My parents offered me none of those things when it mattered most. They showed me their true faces, and once you see that, you can never unsee it. I will not harbor hate for them, because hate is just another chain, another way to keep them tethered to my spirit. Instead, I choose apathy. I choose to let them fade into the background of my life, a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of greed and entitlement. I am 28 years old. My career is taking off, my home is a sanctuary, and my future belongs entirely to me. I survived the hardest heartbreak a son can endure, and I came out the other side intact. I am no longer waiting for an apology that will never come, and I am no longer carrying the ghost of the family I wished I had. I am simply moving forward, one quiet, peaceful day at a time. As the curtain falls on this personal story, let us look at the bigger picture. The story may have ended, but its echoes open up a larger discussion about true boundaries in relationships, especially within families where love is often confused with obligation and sacrifice is quietly expected rather than appreciated. What happened here is not simply a tale of betrayal over money, it is a reflection of a deeper, more uncomfortable truth: how easily roles can become distorted when gratitude turns into entitlement, and support becomes something owed rather than given freely. In many households, especially those shaped by hardship, there exists an unspoken rule: the one who is capable must carry the weight of everyone else. Society often praises this as devotion, as filial duty, as the mark of a good child. But what is rarely discussed is the silent cost of that expectation. Over time, appreciation can erode into resentment, particularly when pride and insecurity begin to take root. In this story, the parents' dependence did not just strain their circumstances, it wounded their sense of self. Instead of confronting that pain, they redirected it toward the very person who was holding everything together. And so, a toxic loop formed. The more he gave, the more they felt diminished, and the more they lashed out. But there comes a moment in every such cycle where reality demands a reckoning, and this is where I want to speak directly to you, and also to myself. Walking away is not the same as abandoning. Telling the truth is not the same as destroying a family. Sometimes the most painful decision is also the most necessary one. Because if love is only allowed to exist when it is convenient, when it benefits others, when it requires your silence and self-erasure, then it is no longer love, it is a transaction. It takes an immense kind of courage to say, enough. To stop playing the role that others have written for you. To refuse to be reduced to a provider, a safety net, or a convenient solution. And yes, that courage often comes with guilt, with doubt, with nights where you question if you were too harsh, too cold. But boundaries are not punishments. They are clarity. They are the line where dignity begins. And perhaps the most difficult truth of all is this: sometimes the people we hope will change don't. Sometimes they only realize your value when you are no longer there to give it. So here is the question that lingers long after the story ends. If the only way to preserve your self-respect is to walk away from the very people who raised you, would you choose to stay and endure, or leave and finally be free?